All right. We're going to get the proceedings started today with Akshat Rati. Now, he is an award-winning senior climate reporter for Bloomberg News. He is also the host of Zero, a weekly climate podcast for Bloomberg Green, and he writes a weekly newsletter on climate solutions. Akshat joins us live from London. Now, he's going to be joined by Sarah Gutterman, the CEO of Green Builder Media, after his presentation for an interactive discussion that I am definitely looking forward to. So, Akshat, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for everybody joining in. That was a lovely introduction, and what I'm going to do with my time as a journalist is I'm going to tell you a few stories around a theme, a few stories from my book Climate Capitalism, so that we can get into a discussion because the topic I cover, the topic you are all here to listen about sustainability and how to act on climate change is one of the most dynamic fields there is. We have constant change, whether that's at a government level, as we are seeing in the US right now, or at a technology level, as we see ever new technologies coming in and incumbents facing new challenges. And so, to me, it is helpful to have some stories of the past that can inform how we manage in this rapidly changing environment, both to deal with the problem that climate change brings, but also to create business opportunities as we tackle this challenge. So let me start with the title of the book, Climate Capitalism. Now, speaking to a largely American audience, you know, there isn't that much of a conflict. Capitalism is something that has brought much benefit to America. And sure, climate change should be able to fit into that box and be able to work in a capitalist economy if we are to bring those solutions. But if that seems like an uncontroversial idea to you, I can assure you, having spoken to people all across the aisle around the world, whether that's activists, climate activists, or whether that's entrepreneurs who obviously are driven by capitalism, or to politicians, it is not yet, even today, seen as a fully set idea that capitalism can actually be a part of the system that tackles climate change. And why is that? The people who are skeptical about capitalism's role in trying to tackle climate change have a point, right? Over the past 200 years, the amount of wealth that we have seen around the world has been powered mostly by fossil fuels. And the costs that have come from using those fossil fuels in the form of pollution, whether that's of air or water or now of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are heating the planet, are costs that have not always been counted in the economy. And so many people pay the costs of pollution, but few people benefit from the benefits of having accessible, cheap energy. And so that problem has lingered on with 3 decades of climate talks that have gone on to try and figure out a solution to deal with this global challenge, trying to bring countries together. And as the bean counters will tell you, emissions keep rising. Last year was the hottest year ever recorded, and it was also the year where we had the highest amount of greenhouse gas emissions put out in history. And so you can see from that point of view, if this system is what got us here, why would people believe that this system can also get us out of the mess? And so, as somebody watching this space, writing about it on a day to day basis, it felt to me that there was a big divide between these two groups, people who believe that capitalism could be the solution, and people who actively wanted to get rid of capitalism because they thought another system is needed to solve this problem. And so, what I did as a journalist is I went around the world to try and find an answer to this seeming conflict. Is there a conflict here? Could capitalism not be reshaped at all to try and solve the climate challenge? And the result was the book, Climate Capitalism, which by the title tells you that what I found is that there are a certain number of things that you can do to make the system work for the climate and not against it. So let me get to the stories. I'm going to tell you three stories, and each of them will have some lessons that could be applied to your specific context, could be applied to your country context, but are stories that definitely have lessons for people in industry. So the first story is of a guy named Wan Gang. Now, Wan Gang is somebody who you may or may not know. The likelihood of you not knowing him, if you've not read the book, is quite high. But I would argue he has done more for the growth and rise and creation of the electric car industry than Elon Musk. Um, and the story of Wan Gang is one that most people don't know about because uh, it's a Chinese person, it's a bureaucrat, and not somebody who has a big, large social media platform to shout out about their achievements. But Wan Gang was born in China. He grew up there. He got a scholarship to go and study in Germany, where he studied automotive engineering. He started working for Audi, making fossil fuel cars. And while he was there in the late 90s, he started to see visits from Chinese ministers coming to Germany, to the automakers, to try and find out why is it that Chinese automakers are so much worse than German ones, and what can they learn from the Germans that could be applied to that industry. And in one of those visits, Wang Gang found out that he was going to see the science minister coming in. And he made the case to the science minister that, look, if China is to be a country that has the kind of quality of life that Germany does, um, we should be thinking about a different technology. Because at that time, and this was in the year 2000, um, Germans burned about 16 barrels of oil per person per year. And the Chinese burned 1 barrel of oil per person per year. If Chinese people, which are, far more in number, would live that kind of lifestyle, burning 16 barrels of oil per year, there just won't be enough oil in the world. And if they did, there would be so much air pollution that they'll have to deal with. Um, and so he said, look, there are other technologies, things like electric cars that are powered by batteries, which, if China invested in early, could be the technology that solves so many of our problems. We don't have to import oil, which we don't have. We can try and deal with air pollution. And we create a technology that, if we can make cheaply, will be the world's largest producer of and supplier of that technology. And so the Chinese minister was skeptical, but said, look, we are interested. We'll give you a government program. Why don't you try and show us what you can do? And so in the rise up to 2008, when China was hosting the Beijing Olympics, he was given the duty of coming up with some electric cars and buses for the athletes who were coming into Beijing. And he made a few dozen electric cars and a few dozen electric buses, and Beijing Olympics was even today considered one of the most splendid, large spending from a government, which had electric cars and buses ferrying athletes. And that early success got the government to think very strategically. Uh, and so by 2011, Wang Gang was made science minister, and he was given the duty to try and create a whole industry in China that would that would make electric cars. And to make electric cars, you would need batteries, so you'd need both industries to form. And what China did over the next decade was a mixture of policies. Some of it was very much state-led subsidies, so making it cheap for car makers to produce those cars by giving them perhaps free land, some lower taxes. But at the same time, it also made it harder for people to buy fossil fuel cars. And so even today, if you're in Shanghai and you want to buy a car, if you want to buy a fossil fuel car, you have to apply for a lottery system, win the lottery, and then you're allowed to buy that car. But if you want to buy an electric car, you could just go to a showroom and buy one. So this combination of carrots and sticks allowed for the creation of, at one point, 400 electric car makers. Even today, there are about 90 car makers that remain in China. And of course, um, you know what has been the impact of that industry. You don't see in America very many Chinese electric cars, but almost anywhere else in the world you go, if you're seeing EVs, you're seeing electric cars, it's either a Tesla or a BYD. And BYD, which is the Chinese electric car, now sells more electric cars in the world than Tesla does. So what we can learn from this story and the stories that follow is that to be able to get a climate technology to scale, to market, to be profitable, you need a combination of three things. You need people like Wanga, you need policy like the ones that the government put out, whether that's incentives or sticks, so that you can move to a new technology. And you need technology itself, right? If you don't have the solutions that are affordable, that are cheap enough, people are not going to buy them. And you might also think that, look, China can do it because they don't have a democracy, they have a dictatorship, and they have the ability to be able to uh, put out all these policies which are, seemingly very good, and they make things work, but they may not be popular, and they don't have to listen to people to get these things done. But turns out the formula that China used to build its electric car industry is a formula which is largely known as industrial policy that has been copied from the uh, the champion of capitalism, from America. So America through the 20th century has used industrial policy in one form or the other, where government has been involved at the early stage of the creation of an industry, and then it backs out once the industry is ongoing and is profitable. It's done that in making trains, in making the rail network. It's done that in making airlines and the airline industry. It's done that more recently in making semiconductor chips, in making biotechnologies possible. At almost every one of these major industries, which you would count as trillion-dollar industries, the government has played a role initially to try and support the industry against an incumbent or against the risk that this industry's technology might not succeed. But when it's succeeded, it's created a whole market for itself where the government is rarely involved at the level that it was in the initial days. It's also a formula that is not the only way to only way to make capitalism work, where you have a heavy-handed government involvement in the creation of an industry. Another route, which is being taken here in Europe, where I live, is to price carbon, is to actually price the pollution and price the cost of that pollution to society, which forces people to move on to cleaner things. And so in Europe, there is a carbon price on the emissions that come from power plants and from industry that exists here in the UK too, which is separated from Europe but still keeps the emissions trading system. And that policy, which seems like a largely a stick policy, right? Like they're telling you you can't pollute. If you do pollute, you have to pay a fine. Also incentivizes companies to move to cleaner technologies. But at the same time, when Europe is doing it, it also realized that it can't simply punish its own industry, because otherwise the industry will suffer. Because if you're importing from, say, China or from India, which does not have a carbon price, then their production is cheaper than the ones that are being made in Europe, where there is a carbon price, and the companies become less competitive. And so Europe has now launched what is known as a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is basically a system where it's not just the companies inside European borders who pay a price on carbon. It's also being charged on the imports that are coming from places like China and India. And so as a result, seeing that Europe is making sure that there's a level playing field for its own domestic industry versus imports, we have seen countries like China and India start to build out a carbon market. China now has a fully functional carbon market. India is considering one. And this idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism is being adopted by other countries. So the UK is in the process of building one. Mark Carney in Canada, who just got elected as Prime Minister, has made it a policy that he's going to install a carbon border adjustment mechanism in Canada. And that way, you're allowing for domestic industries to have the same capacity to be able to develop these technologies in a way that is good for the environment, but also good for people. So those are three examples I wanted to bring up. Through the book, you'll see there are a number of case studies. I go through different technologies, from electric cars to solar, but also to oil, to gas, to the use of different instruments in the financial world, like shareholder activism, to try and get incumbent companies to become more climate friendly. All examples that work within the capitalistic economy that exists in the world today. Ones that require some tweaks because the system as it exists does not address the climate challenge as it must, but those tweaks are being made around the world in different places, and everybody can learn from how to apply them to their own context. And in the US context, right now, the federal government is very much against climate policies of all sorts, and you're seeing that play out in big ways. But the US system is also a federal system, and states have a lot of power. And so we are seeing states push back on certain rules. California is already fighting a lawsuit on, for example, its car emission standards, which California has the ability to put out on its own, but the federal government wants to take that away. And so in that process of having the the experiment of states coming up with their own policy, what can be done, despite a federal government that is not friendly to climate today, is to have states experiment with what is it that works for people and for the environment and for making profits and for bringing in jobs and for being a competitive economy. There are many, many different climate technologies that do that. And now is the time to apply either a new experiment or learn from the experiments that have been going on around the world. I'll end there and look forward to the questions you may have.
Akshat, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I wish we had much more time to listen to your storytelling because clearly you have a lot to share. So I want to start our Q&A first by reminding attendees to please enter any questions that you have into the Q&A box. And I'll try to keep an eye on that and weave those into the questions that I have for Akshat. Let's start just with an announcement that we heard today, breaking news, that in the UK, all new homes will be required to have solar starting in 2027. And that's kind of interesting timing given the blackouts in Spain and Portugal. So can you talk about that within the context of this policy framework and the regulatory framework that you think are essential to support and scale climate capitalism effectively?
Yeah, so I mean, the solar example is actually very interesting, especially from where my journey in this began. So in 2019, my parents live in India. I grew up there. In 2019, I was hoping that I can get solar panels for them in my hometown. And the process even then was remarkably simple. In a couple of days, we had quotes from suppliers. In 2 weeks, the solar panels were up and running. And for a 6 kilowatt system, it only costs $3,000, which is now, as of middle of 2024, been completely recouped by not paying as much electricity bills as my parents used to. So in a period of 5 years, my parents have recovered all the investments on their solar panels. Now, India is a place where installing solar panels is much cheaper than it is in other parts of the world, and so the years in which they could recoup those costs were shorter. But also India is a sunny place, so you get a 5-year return on investment is amazing because solar panels are going to last for 20 years. But even in a country like the UK, which is much more expensive to install solar, which is not as sunny as India is, even here, your break-even costs on solar are 10 years or less. So you are getting to a place where, with current regulations, not even the breaking news that we talked about, solar is a technology that saves households money. But as regulations don't exist, what happens is you have to opt in to build solar after your home has been built. And that is a much more expensive process because then you have to retrofit, you have to make sure that the roof is ready to be able to take on this load. You have to have people in set up the solar panels in a way that is suitable for your specific type of home. And that makes the process much more expensive than it really needs to. And so with this regulation, what will happen is the process of building the solar panel will be fed into the building of the home itself, and that will reduce prices. Now, the context in which it's happening is also interesting, right? We here in Europe, there was a large blackout, perhaps the largest blackout that a Western economy has seen in recent years, when power in Spain and Portugal went down for about half a day. Altogether, and affected tens of millions of people. We still don't know what caused the outage, and there are big questions being asked. What we do know is that Spain is among the countries among the regions like Texas, like California, like Australia, where there's a lot of solar that's on the grid, and especially so during daytime when the outage began. And so it's important to recognize that as much as green technologies are cleaner and now cheaper, they also need to be integrated in a way that make the use of them resilient. And so there are going to be lots of questions about how to make sure that even as this cheap technology is being adopted widely, that we make sure that the grid and the technologies that come with it are operating in a resilient manner.
Thank you. Now, looking ahead, what emerging trends or technologies do you see as game changers in aligning capitalist markets with climate goals?
So the ones that are being adopted at pace right now, you could split the sort of technology set in climate in two buckets. One that are being adopted at a commercial scale, and those are solar and wind and batteries and electric cars. Those have momentum behind them because they are they have investors, but they also are profit making, and so you have multiple industries that have their own momentum and that are going. There are a whole suite of other technologies that are sort of in the middle, which are ready to become commercial, but haven't yet quite got the scale that these other frontier technologies do have. Things like heat pumps, things like home batteries or heat batteries that are being used, which or things like more efficient HVAC technology. These are things that are not yet widely adopted, but have the potential to be. And then there are lots of technologies that are still not yet commercial that need to become commercial from the sort of global ability to try and tackle climate change. So things like carbon removal, which is the ability to pull down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere because we've just put out too much of it. And if we are going to stay in a safe environment, we are going to have to also remove some of this excess carbon dioxide eventually, and you need to build those technologies today, or things like nuclear fusion, which are technologies that have been worked on for decades, but might just become commercial within the next decade or two, and could provide really clean, unlimited power, and are worthy of investments even as we develop the mature technologies on climate that we do have.
Thank you. And my final question for you, just because we've got a couple minutes before we have to wrap up, is in your book, Climate Capitalism, you argue that capitalism, while a driver of climate change, can also be its solution. So how do you reconcile the inherent growth-driven nature of capitalism with finite resources of our planet? And I also want to weave in a question that was put into the Q&A, which is, do we just basically have to reconcile in our own minds that things are going to be more expensive in order to solve for climate, or do those economics even out with the supply and demand curve?
Yeah, very good question. So on the growth side, it's worth recognizing that growth doesn't just come from greater material use. That has been the case in the past, but we've also started to dematerialize growth. So a lot of economic growth that comes these days is not because you are producing a ton of copper or iron ore, but it's because you are creating an AI technology that is helping people solve problems on a day-to-day basis. And so that split between growth of materials versus growth of the economy is there, and it can grow faster. One way to do that is actually to use fewer fossil fuels. So today, in terms of extraction, we extract billions and billions of tons of oil, gas, and coal for the fuels that we need, while we extract maybe tens of millions of tons of metal that we use to build things like solar panels or electric cars. And so if you're able to use, plentiful sun and wind, which are renewable energy sources, you stop using as much material in terms of fossil fuels that is being extracted. So I don't think growth and climate are opposite as they seem to be. It is certainly true that growth of materials and climate can be opposite, and there is a way to dematerialize as we build the climate solution set. Now, the question about cost is a very important one that we have grappled with very strongly across the world and it's shown up in election results, right? One of the reasons for a Donald Trump presidency is because people are tired with the cost of living. Is the same case here in the UK when the previous Conservative government was kicked out and Labour was brought in. It was because of the cost of living. So cost is really important, but there are ways in which you manage it and you can do it right. So this is why the sort of subsidies that governments provide for frontier technologies is crucial, because it's allowed people to make greener choices, even when the greener choices are more expensive. So an electric car, even today, is more expensive than an equivalent gasoline car. But with a tax credit, you can make that solution set work. And so that is one way to do it. But the other one is, once you have done it, things are just cheaper. People are building solar panels on homes here in the UK. So about 40% of new homes are being built with solar panels today, out of choice, because solar is the cheaper option for them to have. But now with regulation, that's just going to make it even cheaper for them to build solar. So the cost equation is a very important one, and one that we should never forget, because without making these solutions affordable now and in the long run, they are not going to be adopted. And people, rightly choose comforts before they choose saving the planet. We should make it easier to do both.
Indeed. Well, Akshat, thank you so much for your insights. I really recommend that anyone in attendance check out Akshat's book, Climate Capitalism. You can get it on Amazon, or you can get it in the link that's posted in the chat. Akshat, I can't wait to hear more of your stories. And again, thank you for your time.